Very warm welcome to BBC News, broadcasting to our viewers in North America and around the globe. My name is Mike Hembley. Our top stories. A new NAFTA. President Trump says he's reached agreement with Mexico over a new trade deal.
It's been a long time, and this is something that's very special for our manufacturers and for our farmers from both countries.
Myanmar's government rejects claims of genocidal intent against its top generals in a report backed by the UN. After a murder in the German city of Chemnitz, a second evening of violence, thousands of far-right demonstrators clash with anti-fascist protesters. And the threat to the American military base on Diego Garcia. Mauritius wants the island back, and it's winning international support. Hello to you. The US and Mexico have agreed to overhaul the North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA. President Trump was quick to hail it as an important step towards an incredible deal that was much more fair, but the final shape is far from clear. Canada, the third country in NAFTA, has not been part of these negotiations with Mexico. US and Mexican officials are to resume trade talks on Tuesday, though Donald Trump has said he is not committed to a three-country agreement. We'll go over those details in a moment, but first, the President.
It's been a long time, and this is something that's very special for our manufacturers and for our farmers from both countries, for all of the people that work for jobs. It's also great trade, and it makes it a much more fair bill, and we are very, very excited about it. We have worked long and hard. Your representatives have been terrific. My representatives have been fantastic, too. They've gotten along very well, and they've worked late into the night for months. It's an extremely complex bill, and it's something that I think will be talked about for many years to come.
A happy President there. The BBC's David Willis is following events in Washington, D.C.
Classic hyperbole from Donald Trump there, Mike. Incredible, possibly the best trade deal ever reached. Mexico, I have to say, is pretty pleased as well. But the big question here is, what does Canada make of all this? To give you a bit of background, President Trump vowed, even on the campaign trail, that he wanted to withdraw, tear up the NAFTA agreement, which he said was horrible and that was costing American manufacturing jobs. He's reached this agreement with Mexico, but the Canadians are still in the dark, and their trade negotiator is on her way to the United States for talks. Now, President Trump has said he would like to wrap this up by the end of the week. It remains to be seen, of course, how the Canadians negotiate with a gun to their head, Mike.
If the Canadians are really unhappy with this, what is likely to happen, if anything? Does that make any difference to President Trump?
Well, it's interesting because, you know what, a lot of people have a stake in this. Republicans who are standing for re-election in the midterms in November would like to have some sort of deal in place to protect their farmers, to protect anybody basically who's has an interest in trade with Canada and Mexico. Mexico has an interest in this because 80% of its trade is done with North America. And President Trump, in a sort of take it or leave it type mode, has said to the Canadians, well, if you don't reach agreement with us and sign up to this, we'll make it a bilateral deal instead of a trilateral deal. And we might even slap tariffs on Canadian exports of cars. So a lot of trading and dealing to be done over the next few days here, Mike.
We'll let you know. David Willis there. Myanmar has rejected the result of a United Nations investigation which accused the country's military leaders of crimes against humanity, war crimes and genocide against Rohingya Muslims. The inquiry found evidence of murder, rape and torture against Rohingya, mostly in Myanmar's Rakhine state. Hundreds of thousands have been forced to flee across the border into Bangladesh. It's from there that Nick Beak filed this. Just a warning, there are distressing accounts and flash photography.
For a year now, in this bleak landscape, the Rohingya have been suffering. Bereaved. Uprooted. Lost. giving harrowing accounts of the brutality they say they suffered at the hands of the Myanmar military. Today we met Rashid. He says they murdered 12 of his relatives.
They made the men stand and the women and children squat on the ground. Then they opened fire and killed the men. Then they took the women inside a house and set it on fire.
He's convinced it was genocide. And so, while he welcomes today's call for the top generals to be tried for that crime, he thinks it's all too late for so many.
If justice is done, then people who are living will see it. But what about those who were slaughtered? My mother, my brothers, my nephew, my uncles. Can they bring them back? They can't do it.
Tula Toli is the village in Myanmar from which Rashid fled. The killing, rape and arson here is said to have been part of a coordinated campaign by the army.
You know, it's not only about justice for victims, but it's also deterring future activity. If you allow this to go without any kind of sanction, then every army in the world will think they can do this.
This is the most detailed and blistering criticism yet of the actions of Myanmar's military last year. Actions which forced hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people to flee across the border to these camps where they're still trapped. But there's also strong criticism of Myanmar's civilian government, in particular its Nobel Peace Prize winning leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. She's accused of failing to use her moral authority to prevent the violence, and that by ignoring the plight of the Rohingya, her government made it easier for the crimes to be carried out. Tonight, Myanmar rejected the UN report as flawed and one-sided. The army's always claimed it was only clearing out militants, a claim now wholly rejected by the United Nations. Bringing Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing and his comrades to court will not be easy. But today feels like a significant step forward in the pursuit of justice for the Rohingya people. Nick Beek, BBC News, on the Myanmar-Bangladesh border.
Hundreds of far-right protesters have gathered in the eastern German city of Chemnitz in response to a fatal stabbing on Sunday morning. A Syrian and an Iraqi man have been arrested on suspicion of murder. The protesters are calling for an end to immigration, and there are reports of outbreaks of violence. Andrew Plant reports.
The East German city of Chemnitz, in front of its Karl Marx memorial, several thousand demonstrators chanting anti-immigration slogans. Police reported seeing Hitler salutes too. Tensions here are high after a German man was stabbed on Sunday. A Syrian and an Iraqi man were arrested, and a wave of anti-immigration protest took to the streets.
Now is the time to remain calm and level-headed. The police are investigating and the prosecuting authorities are doing their jobs. Chemnitz will not allow the perpetrators of violence and anarchists to run rampant on our streets. We will enforce the rule of law.
Police warned masked demonstrators in the city, which is 200 kilometres south of the capital Berlin, that their actions were being filmed. Flowers have been laid where the 35-year-old man was stabbed to death. In the hours after the killing, far-right groups took to social media to call for public demonstrations against immigration.
It does exist, the right-wing extremist scene which rears its head every once in a while. There is also a certain mixture of different groups, for example, football fans.
In 2015, Germany gave home to more than 1 million migrants, many from the Middle East, a stance that proved unpopular with many voters. In Chemnitz, counter-demonstrators called for calm and tolerance. There are reports that immigrants have suffered abuse in the city in the wake of the stabbing. Chancellor Angela Merkel said Germany would not tolerate vigilante justice. Local prosecutors said the 2 suspects were still being questioned. Andrew Plant, BBC News.
Let's quickly run up some more of the main news for you. Australia's new cabinet's been sworn in. The ruling Liberal Party, of course, voted to elect Scott Morrison as its new Prime Minister on Friday, replacing Malcolm Turnbull. Leadership rival Peter Dutton has retained his Home Affairs job. Fellow contender Julie Bishop has been replaced. One of the world's biggest car makers, the Japanese company Toyota, has announced a $500 million investment in the American ride-sharing firm Uber. They'll work together on developing self-driving cars. Uber suffered a severe setback this year when a pedestrian in Arizona was killed by one of its self-driving vehicles. Iran has asked the International Court of Justice to lift the sanctions imposed by the US when Washington abandoned the deal on Tehran's nuclear program. The Iranian legal team say the US aims to damage Iran's economy as severely as possible and has violated a little-known 1955 friendship treaty. The US is expected to argue the sanctions don't breach the treaty. The French president has said Europe needs to face up to its security responsibilities and can no longer rely on the US alone. Emmanuel Macron said current alliances were still relevant, but the balances and mechanisms they're built on need to be revisited. Donald Trump has issued his first official non-social media statement on the death of John McCain amid a row over the position of the US flag flying over the White House. The flag was lowered at the weekend, raised again early on Monday, only to be lowered back, apparently because of public pressure. The president also confirmed he will not attend the funeral next weekend. From Washington, Nick Bryant.
Washington without John McCain is a lesser place. He was a human landmark, an American hero whose broken body personified the land of the brave. Flags at the US Capitol remained at half-mast in honor of his service and sacrifice. But at the White House, where the flag was lowered at the weekend, there was no such act of ongoing remembrance earlier on today. In a tweet over the weekend, Donald Trump paid his deepest sympathies and respect to the McCain family, but had no kind words for the man himself.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, do you have any thoughts on John McCain? Do you have any thoughts at all about John McCain?
That presidential silence continued today.
Do you believe John McCain was a hero, sir?
Guys, let's go.
But with the American Legion strongly urging the Commander-in-Chief to honor this war hero and former prisoner of war, there was finally a presidential change of view, if not heart. We've just got this statement from the President. Despite our differences on policy and politics, I respect Senator John McCain's service to our country and in his honor have signed a proclamation to fly the flag of the United States at half-staff until the day of his interment. But it still doesn't call him a hero. So tonight the Stars and Stripes was lowered again at the White House in that rare thing, a presidential climb down. But the flag row has come to symbolize a broader debate as to who best embodies the values of modern America, Donald Trump or John McCain. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
Much more to come for you on BBC News, including this. A ride-hailing war comes to Cambodia, where local tuk-tuk drivers face tough competition, drawing its inspiration from India.
He's the first African American to win the presidential nomination of a major party, and he accepts exactly 45 years ago to the day that Martin Luther King declared, "I have a dream."
As darkness falls tonight, an unfamiliar light will appear in the southeastern sky, an orange glowing disk that's brighter than anything save the moon, our neighbouring planet, Mars.
There is no doubt that this election is an important milestone in the birth of East Timor as the world's newest nation.
It'll take months and billions of dollars to repair what Katrina achieved in just hours.
3 weeks is the longest the great clock has been off duty in 117 years. So it was with great satisfaction that clockmaker John Vernon swung the pendulum to set the clock going again.
Good to have you with us on BBC News. One main headline for you this hour. After a year of talks, the United States and Mexico have reached agreement on a new trade deal. The Mexican president-elect has said Canada needs to be included too. And we've been hearing that the Canadian Premier has been on the phone with President Trump. They've agreed to keep talking on this issue. I spoke just now to Philip Cross, an economic analyst from the University of Calgary. I asked him how difficult Canada's position is now.
Well, I think it's in a lot worse position than at the beginning of these talks. I mean, any time that a country gets isolated in trade talks, when it appears to be 2 against 1 now and the other 2 have agreed to something, that's going to put a lot of pressure on Canada to make concessions, to go along with what the Mexicans and Americans have already negotiated.
One of the difficulties, I guess, is the sunset clause, isn't it, so-called? Why is that so vital?
Well, without a sunset clause, with a sunset clause, that would put a lot of pressure on firms to make their investments in the United States. If they're not assured that you're going to have access to the American market, which is the name of the game in all this, if that could be taken away in even 5 or 10 years, and you're making investments with a lifespan of 20, 30 years, you're going to make that investment in the United States to make sure that you have access to that American market. So the sunset clause has been vital for probably the most important thing for Canada all along. I think the Mexicans knew this, and I think it's quite disappointing to Canada that Mexico, knowing that this was so important to Canada, went ahead and negotiated this with the United States on a bilateral basis. Time will tell how much they kept Canada informed on this, but apparently not very much.
What do you think Canada can do about this situation?
I think it puts Canada in a very difficult position. I mean, you saw Trump today when he was announcing that he had reached a deal with Mexico. He very pointedly said that if Canada cannot come to the table and make a deal by Friday, he's going to put tariffs on the automotive industry. That is the key leverage the U.S. can exercise on all this. The most important thing for Canada, above everything else, is maintaining the access of our auto industry to the United States. So Trump has honed in very well on the weakness of Canada and saying that if you don't agree with this very quickly, we're going to take away the thing that's most important to you. So this is going to put a lot of pressure on Canada to make some concessions and come to a deal quickly.
And talking of leverage, I mean, the president has a point, doesn't he, when he says the U.S. has been suffering under a bad NAFTA deal. The U.S. could have extracted more in the original deal.
Yeah, I would argue it really wasn't a bad deal for anybody, but unquestionably the U.S. holds the whip hand in all this. I mean, the whole point of free trade for Canada and Mexico is to get access to that big American market. Canada especially is a very small country compared to the U.S. We don't have the economies of scale, the population base the U.S. has. So access to the American market is vital for us. And the Americans probably didn't extract all the concessions they could have in the original NAFTA deal. In the original free trade deal with the United States, Canada put about a quarter of its economy off limits to the U.S. The supply management deal that protected agriculture. There was also protection for banking, telecommunications, for a number of our key industries. And the U.S. kind of went along with this. They didn't agree for their banking system or to be put off limits. So they made a lot of concessions to Canada, and they're coming back now and saying, you know, we want more.
The Canadian analyst Philip Cross there. The UK is facing an increasingly bitter tug of war with one of its former African colonies in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius. The Chagos Islands used to be part of Mauritius, but they were detached in 1965, and one of them, Diego Garcia, has long been home to a major American military base. Next week, Mauritius will argue before the United Nations top court, the International Court of Justice, that Britain should return the Chagos Islands. Andrew Harding reports.
It's a serene setting for a diplomatic storm. Today, the tiny tourist paradise of Mauritius is taking on the British government. And, against all odds, it may be winning. At stake, the fate of these slivers of land, the Chagos Islands. Legally, they belong to Britain. Decades ago, the entire population was thrown off the islands by British troops so that the largest atoll, Diego Garcia, could be converted into a military base for the United States. At the time, Mauritius wanted to keep the islands, but it was still a British colony. Prime Minister Harold Wilson told a Mauritian delegation the fate of the Chagos Islands was non-negotiable. Only one person at that meeting is still alive today to recall Wilson's ultimatum to the Mauritian leader.
He told him, if you don't agree to what I am proposing, then forget about independence. You will go back. Mauritius will remain our colony, will belong to us, we'll do what we want.
Blackmail, then?
That was real blackmail.
Today, on Mauritius, those families deported from the Chagos Islands conjure up the tastes and smells of home and sing laments about the paradise the British forced them to leave. Samina Den Rosemond was 36 when he left. Now he's 81. We even had to leave our dog behind, he remembers. I just want to go home so I can die there in peace. For decades, Britain has said no. But now a team of international lawyers is helping Mauritius to fight back, to try to reclaim the islands. And, quite unexpectedly, at the United Nations, the world is backing Mauritius against Britain.
One way of looking at this story is of truly the end of empire and the end of colonialism, coinciding with a moment where Britain seems to be turning inward, losing on a serious scale its international support.
But that hasn't stopped Britain from playing tough. Sources close to the Mauritian government have told us they were threatened by the then Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson.
I must say that unfortunately we have been threatened with retaliation in terms of trade, in terms of politics.
By Britain?
By Britain and by the Americans also.
This is Boris Johnson picking up the phone?
Well, I have had a number of people, both from the UK, from the US, talking to me, talking to members.
And threatening you?
Well, we have had verbal threats, I must say.
It's a remarkable claim. Did the British government threaten a trade war with tiny Mauritius, a close ally? The Foreign Office wouldn't respond to that question, but said, "We are disappointed that Mauritius is taking the matter to court. Britain has repeatedly promised to hand the islands back to Mauritius when no longer required for defence purposes." An old British fort looms over the capital of Mauritius, a reminder of past power struggles. Today, Britain is being dragged reluctantly to court over this territorial dispute. The UN's highest tribunal will hear arguments next week. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Mauritius.
And we'll be following that story closely next month. Of course, the moped-powered taxis known as tuk-tuks have long been a feature of the Cambodian capital. Conveyors of goods and passengers, handmade, locally produced and for a long time beloved by locals and tourists. They have felt the pinch of competition as customers seek out the more affordable rickshaws imported from India that use ride-hailing apps. From Phnom Penh, Nick Wood on the demise of an iconic form of transport and the rapid rise of a young contender.
There's a new gang in town. Young, colourful, speedy, and you see them just about everywhere in Phnom Penh. But all's not well on the capital's increasingly crowded streets, where ageing cyclos, mototaxis, locally made tuk-tuks and cars all battle for road space. Now there's the auto rickshaw to contend with. Their popularity has caused a ripple of discontent among the legions of tuk-tuk owners who see their way of life and incomes under threat.
Before the rickshaws arrived, everyone used tuk-tuks. But the rickshaws use LPG, so they are cheaper. And they also use a phone network, which we don't have. So now customers prefer them over us.
Many auto rickshaws are equipped with PassApp, a Cambodian version of Uber or Grab, and this new ride-hailing platform has quickly won over passengers, no longer content to haggle over the fare.
I changed from tuk-tuk to rickshaw because now customers can book me by the phone app. Passengers like to use rickshaws because the route and the cost pop up on their phones, so there's no argument about price.
While the drivers of the old and the new carriages might see themselves as competitors, there's a potential solution that could see both sides coming together.
We are in the middle, we understand the market, we understand about the driver. That's why we encourage the driver for the traditional tuk-tuk to join us.
There's little doubt the auto rickshaw is here to stay. The question now is, can both sides coexist, or is the auto rickshaw firmly in the driver's seat? Nick Wood, BBC News, Phnom Penh.
More for you on all the news anytime on the BBC website. You can get in touch with me and most of the team on Twitter. I'm at BBC Mike Embley. Thank you for watching.